briefing of 2026. So this quarterly briefing will look at the outcome of the Monetary Policy Committee and Financial Stability Committee meetings, which were held this week. And it also reflects our commitment as a central bank to transparent, data-driven and forward-looking policy making. So I will begin with the Monetary Policy Committee's analysis of recent economic developments, inflation data for 2025 and projections for 2026, which informed the committee's decision to help safeguard price stability and sustain the country's economic growth, as well as prosperity that Rwandans work hard to build every day. First, in its meeting, the Monetary Policy Committee always starts with evaluating the developments of the global economy, as well as trends. And the MPC observed that amidst persistent trade tensions and geopolitical uncertainties, the global economy's growth levels remain below the pre-COVID average and are projected to evolve at a moderate pace. We project that for the full year of 2025, global GDP growth will remain at 3.3%, the same level of growth that's projected for 2026, and a slower growth in 2027. And where this we compared with an average of about 3.7 GDP growth globally that were recorded across the globe before the COVID period in 2020. For our region, in sub-Saharan Africa, GDP growth is projected at 4.4% for the full year of 2025 and will increase slightly to 4.6% in both 2026 and 2027, which reflects slightly improving economic conditions in sub-Saharan Africa. Looking at global inflation trends, inflationary pressures continue to ease in most regions, with globally inflation projected to decline from 4.1% in 2025 to 3.8% in 2026. And this is due to better supply conditions and the effects of recent monetary policy tightening in most economies. In sub-Saharan Africa, inflation remains elevated in double digits, at 13.1% for the full year 2025, whereas in 2026 for sub-Saharan Africa, inflation is projected to decrease at 10.9% and again declining to 8.9% in 2027. The higher inflation that we see in our region is mainly driven by a number of countries in Northern and Southern Africa, which still have high inflation due to currency pressures, but also volatile food prices that persist. The committee also analyzed international commodity prices, which remain an important driver of external balances and inflation trends for our country. We can see that energy prices are projected to decline by 11.2% in 2026, and this is mainly due to expected decline in crude oil prices, which are expected to fall by 13% in 2026 before rising by 8.3% in 2027. And this trends in crude oil prices reflects OPEC's production adjustments as well as global demand patterns. And that's why we can see that for energy prices in 2027, the energy index points to an increase of 6.3% in 2027. For food prices, they are projected to decline by 0.3% in 2026 and rise modestly to 0.8% in 2027. And this should translate into reduced imported inflation pressures for Rwanda. Meanwhile, on the non-energy commodity index, which includes metals that Rwanda's export earnings depend on, is projected to decline by 1.3% in 2026 and again decline by 0.4% in 2027. So overall, commodity prices are projected to stabilize. Turning to our external sector, merchandise exports increased significantly in the fourth quarter of 2025, almost an increase of almost 30%, and that was driven primarily by robust performances in traditional exports, which increased by 69%. And this is more mainly driven by coffee, mineral export revenues, and favorable global prices. Non-traditional exports also recorded notable gains, rising by 10% from processed cooking oil and wheat flour, further strengthening overall export performance, while also re-exports increased by 26%, reflecting increased demand from our region. On the import side, merchandise imports recorded an increase of 16.8% in the fourth quarter of 2025, driven by higher demand for core food items such as raw cooking oil and rice, as well as construction raw materials and some ICT devices. And so if you look at the full year of 2025, our external sector performed strongly, with export from January to December increasing by 14%. Merchandise imports also increasing, but at a lower pace at 6.9%. And our trade deficit, although increasing, it's a smaller widening than what we used to, because it widened only by 2.7%. And these developments have stabilized our currency, where we see that the performance of our external sector, as I just mentioned, coupled with stronger tourism receipts and increased remittance inflows, contributed to the destabilization of the Rwandan franc versus the US dollar, where the depreciation rate over the full year of 2025 was at 4.4% compared to the high depreciation we had in 2024 at 9.4%, and even higher depreciation a year prior, 2023, where inflation had reached 18%. With this slower pace of depreciation reflects not only improvements in our trade balance, but also the positive effects of domestic foreign exchange market reforms and the impact of a broader weakening of the US dollar in global FX markets throughout 2025. After those evaluating the trends on global economy, on global inflation, as well as external sector, the committee looked at the performance of our own domestic economy, and Rwanda's economy continues to exhibit strong growth momentum. The economy grew by an average of 8.7% during the first 3 quarters of 2025, that is from January to September. The GDP growth numbers for the full year of 2025 will be announced by the National Institute of Statistics in March. But when we look at our own composite index of economic activity, which measures turnover in the manufacturing and services sector, it has grown in the fourth quarter by 17%. And this signals sustained strength in aggregate demand. And so based on this index, we estimate that our GDP growth for the full year of 2025 will also be stronger than the GDP growth of 2024, which was at 7.2%. The strong performance of our economy is mainly driven by the services and industry sectors. For services, we've seen high growth in wholesale and retail trade, in transport, in IT services, as well as financial services. For the industry sector, the growth is more all attributed to all subsectors, being manufacturing, construction, but also mining and quarry. For agriculture, the sector recorded a moderate performance, although the strong performance of export crops, especially coffee, offset the lower than expected production in Season A 2026. The committee also assessed monetary conditions in the fourth quarter of 2025. We observed that the interbank rate rose to 6.87% in the fourth quarter last year, which reflects the 25 basis point rise in the central bank rate, which the MPC had decided in November. And the interbank rate movements confirms that monetary transmission mechanism continue to operate for money markets. Deposit rates have fallen significantly by 152 basis points, reaching 8.98% from a level of 10.5% that we had in the last quarter of 2024. The lending rates are also reducing at 15.7% at the end of the fourth quarter, which is a 13 basis points decline compared to the same period in 2024. So what we observe on market rates is that interbank rate moves closer to the central bank rate, while market rates do not yet fully respond to tighter policy stance, given the limitations in our own monetary policy transmission mechanism for our market, which is still developing and still needs financial deepening. So the last set of analysis done by the MPC was related to inflation developments. And after having assessed the global economic trends, domestic economic performance, foreign exchange market developments, and monetary conditions, which all contribute to inflation developments, we observed that for the fourth quarter of 2025, year-on-year headline inflation increased to 7.4%, a slight increase from the previous quarter, where headline inflation was at 7.2%. This increase was mainly driven by increases in core and energy inflation, which outweighed the decline in fresh food inflation in the last quarter of 2025. You can see on the chart that core inflation increased to 9% from 8.1%. So that's the main contributor to the headline inflation we're seeing. Energy inflation also rose sharply to 12.4%. From the 3.3% increase in the previous quarter. And conversely, fresh food inflation fell to 1.4% from the 5.6% in food inflation that we had in the third quarter of 2025. And the inflation pressures that we've seen in the last quarter of the year came from housing, restaurants, and hotels prices. Also higher electricity tariffs, which were introduced in October 2025, as well as increases in charcoal and fuel pump prices, which were revised upwards in November 2025. And these developments were compounded by the lingering effects of earlier adjustments in administered prices, particularly medical service fees and education-related costs, which were introduced in the last half of 2025. Looking at the last headline inflation data that we have for January 2026, it stood at 8.9%, as you have all seen when the NISR published this data. And this reflects the continued pressure that we've seen in the different components of CPI that I just enumerated, analyzing the fourth quarter inflation. So the MPC considered inflation projection for 2026, with headline inflation forecast to remain slightly above the upper bound of 8% before starting to decline in the second half of 2026 to levels within the 2 to 8% target band. And when we compare the new projections to the previous MPC round in November, the upward revision for 2026 mainly reflects weaker than expected food supply in the last 2 months of 2025, higher than anticipated increases in fuel pump prices, as well as stronger inflation pressures from core components such as housing, restaurants, and hotels that I mentioned in the previous section. The Monetary Policy Committee also acknowledged what many of you are experiencing right now, that prices remain high overall, that be it the cost of food items in markets, being electricity or fuel for transport, households and businesses are feeling the pressure, and this is confirmed in our consumer expectation surveys. Food inflation in our projection is expected to remain relatively elevated during the first 3 quarters of 2026 due to subdued agricultural production. Energy inflation is projected to also remain positive over the policy horizon, and core inflation is expected to start declining in the second half of 2026 as domestic and imported cost pressures moderate. Should the risks that we see, meaning 1, lower than expected agricultural production, 2, persistent energy-related cost pressure, 3, global and regional geopolitical tensions, our outlook may change, subject to these upside risks materializing. And also, these projections that I just mentioned of inflation slightly above the upper bound of 8%, especially in the first half of 2026, this observation made the committee resolve to continue closely monitoring economic developments in food supply conditions, especially in regional and global trade dynamics, in energy prices, because these are factors that may affect on the near-term inflation path that we are currently seeing from our analysis. And so in view of more persistent inflationary pressures and an upward revision of the inflation outlook, the Monetary Policy Committee decided to increase the central bank rate from 6.75% to 7.25%, and that's an increase of 50 basis points. The decision to raise the central bank rate is a measured step that we are taking to bring inflation back within the target band between 2% and 8%, to safeguard price stability, which is a necessary condition to sustain our economic growth, as well as protect the purchasing power of Rwandans over the medium term. The MPC will continue to monitor inflation and economic developments and stands ready to adjust the policy if inflationary pressures intensify beyond our projections. But equally, if inflation declines more rapidly than anticipated, the MPC will assess the possibility to ease the monetary policy stance. As central bank, we are committed to data-driven and forward-looking policy decisions to ensure that inflation converges towards the target range of 2 to 8% in the medium term. We will now move on to the outcome of the Financial Stability Committee. The Financial Stability Committee held also its meetings this week and assessed the overall stability and performance of Rwanda's financial sector, and it concluded that the financial sector in Rwanda remains sound, resilient, and well-positioned to support the economy in spite of global economic uncertainties. So our presentation will explore the reason behind this assertion. First, we observed that our financial sector continued to expand alongside solid economic performance, supporting increased credit to households and businesses. Total financial sector assets from January to December 2025 increased by about 24%, reaching 15.9 trillion Rwandan francs. And this was on the back of deposit growth, which enabled growth of loans, higher pension contributions, improved investment income, and improved insurance premiums. Importantly, the growth that we recorded in the financial sector was recorded in all subsectors. Banks' assets increased by 22.7%. For microfinance institution, growth of assets was at 22.9%, and the insurance sector grew by 14.3%. When we look at the pension sector, their total assets also grew by 35.3%. And in non-deposit taking financial institutions, which are a new category of institutions that lend but do not take deposits, the decline of 10% that we see is not due to the shrinking of their balance sheets, but more from the transfer of BDF assets to BRD, the Rwanda Development Bank. And so overall, the NDTFI sector also remained on a growth path, while Forex Bureau grew by 8.3% in the same period from January to December 2025. The committee also assessed the lending activities, observing rapid credit growth. Outstanding loan portfolio across the banking, microfinance, and non-deposit taking financial institutions rose by 25%, reaching 6 trillion Rwandan francs. And banks account for the majority of outstanding loans at 87%, while 12% of all outstanding loans are from the microfinance institutions, and the non-deposit taking financial institution contribute a smaller share of 1%. Looking at top financed sectors, the credit allocation remains concentrated in a few sectors. Trade, which represent 20% of all outstanding loans, followed by construction at 19.8%, personal loans at 16%, and then manufacturing at 14.8%. Together, the four top finance sectors account for 70% of outstanding loans across all institutions. And this distribution that we see of where lending is going reflects areas or sectors with strong economic activity, as well as established repayment capacity and structured financing models. However, despite this very positive growth in lending activities, the committee observed that financing to agriculture remains low and similar to financing overall of strategic sectors. And even though there has been a gradual improvement in access to credit for farmers and agriculture projects in recent quarters, for instance, in banks, we've seen that share of agriculture loans to total banks' loans portfolio increased from 0.6% that we had in 2024 to 1.3% in 2025, and this is really still a very low level. However, for microfinance, these are great financiers of agriculture because their share of agriculture loans to their total portfolio is at 15.5% from January to December 2025, and this is an increase from 12.8% share they had in 2024. Especially, we observed that the SACCO networks continue to support a large number of smallholder farmers. But despite these improvements, the Financial Stability Committee resolved to fast-track the ongoing assessment of agriculture lending to fully understand the underlying constraints and inform further policy actions to boost financing in these sectors. On other sectors where financing significantly varies, manufacturing remains relatively underfinanced, especially by microfinance, and we are continuing to assess constraints to financing to strategic sectors to ensure that our economy and also the financing that goes to different economic sectors are aligned to the development goals of the country. The committee assessed the quality of loan portfolios, which continued to improve with low levels of defaults. In banks, non-performing loans stood at 2.5% at end December 2025. And for microfinance institutions, the NPL ratio was also at 2.5%, a decline from 3.5% in the same period. And this was supported by prudent credit risk management in banks and MFIs, and a broader base of new loans in both subsectors. But we noted some challenges in some SACCOs where non-performing loans are still above the 5% prudential benchmark, and we are taking appropriate measures to make sure that risk management practices in those SACCOs are strengthened and that they can reduce the level of defaulting loans in their portfolio. On a more positive note, newly formed district SACCOs are showing encouraging signs of improving asset quality, and we might remember that we now have 28 district SACCOs that have been formed, consolidating Umurenge SACCOs. For non-deposit taking financial institution, the committee also assessed the asset quality, which continues to improve, with the NPL ratio declining compared to 2024. After assessment of lending activities and the quality of assets, the Financial Stability Committee assessed the stability indicators of the financial sector, starting with capital. And financial institutions continue to hold adequate capital buffers, enabling them to provide financial services and withstand potential shocks. Capital adequacy in the banking sector improved at 21.9%. At end December 2025, and in the microfinance sector, capital buffers also grew to 33.8%, and both for banks and microfinance sector, the capital adequacy ratio are well above the prudential requirements. For the insurance sector, the solvency ratio also improved, increasing previous slide. For the insurance sector, solvency ratio increased to 306%, and this is really a significant improvement of the solvency ratio of the insurance sector, which was largely driven by a decline in premium receivables, which we had highlighted as a challenge in the last FSC round and briefing, and this improved the balance sheet of insurance sectors. Going to the liquidity indicators, the financial sector maintains sufficient liquidity buffers to fulfill their short-term obligations and clients' needs. Liquidity ratios remained well above the minimum requirements, be it for banks, microfinance, and insurance sector. The Financial Stability Committee noted that the high liquidity coverage ratio that we see for banks at 358% is mainly driven by government securities which banks have invested in. These securities are qualified as high liquid assets, making 40% of high liquid assets. But the liquidity levels in banks, if we were to remove those government assets, has remained moderate, especially in the second half of 2025. Overall, for the financial sector, the ample liquidity that we see reflect quality of assets, as well as low loan default rates and safe investments, providing buffers to meet their short-term obligations. Regarding profitability, earnings in the banking sector and microfinance remained positive, while lending rates were easing, as we observed in the monetary data that we presented in the MPC briefing section. We can observe that banks continued to post double-digit returns on equity. The moderate growth in profits for banks was driven by lower growth of interest income, as well as an increase in overhead costs, but overall banks remained profitable. The microfinance institutions had a return on assets and return on equity slightly decline because of a moderation in growth of interest income, but also the return on equity, which declined following larger capital base. As I mentioned, for the capital of microfinance institutions, we observed an increase because of retained earnings, which beefed up their paid-up capital. The insurance sector also saw an increase in their return on equity due to an increase in their profit, having return on equity now at 21%, driven by an increase in investment income for insurance sector. Looking at the pension sector, its performance remained strong, as evidenced by increase in contribution, first for the public pension funds, a fund where contribution increased by 122% from January to December 2025, and this was due to the increase in the new contribution rates in the public pension. For the private pension sector, also contribution increased by 19.3%, driven by an increase in number of contributors. And if we look at Ejoheza, the contribution also grew by 19%. And this was on the back of mobilization efforts supporting higher participation from the informal sector, which represents 77% of contributors to Ejoheza and remains the largest source of membership to the long-term savings scheme. Recent reforms that Cabinet approved for Ejo Heza are expected to further support the growth of the long-term savings scheme, as well as enhance the beneficiaries' social well-being. The last subsector that the Financial Stability Committee analyzed was the payment systems, where we evaluated the continued progress on the cashless agenda, with electronic value as a share, payments as a share of GDP rising significantly from 302% of GDP in terms of value to 336% from January to December 2025. Retail payments expanded, reaching a total value of 77 trillion Rwandan francs, compared to 50 trillion that we had in 2024. And this increase and very good performance of the payment systems is on the back of continued adoption of digital payment channels, but also the trust in payment system, which continue to operate reliably with high systems availability rates across wholesale and retail payment infrastructure, which supported smooth and uninterrupted financial transactions. So on the financial sector outlook, after assessment of global conditions, capital and liquidity buffers, as well as financial sector growth, asset quality and operational resilience, the Financial Stability Committee estimates that our financial system is expected to remain resilient and well positioned to absorb potential shocks. Payment systems remain stable, ensuring smooth delivery of financial services, while the capital and liquidity buffers for banks, microfinance, as well as insurance companies point to a resilient financial system overall in the country. The committee also looked at risks to the financial stability in the next 3 months and decided to monitor the following risks: the credit concentration of loans that we've touched upon, analyzing lending activities to different economic sectors. We will continue to analyze the lower financing that go to strategic sectors and take policy actions, as well as advise government accordingly on policy measures needed to improve that financing. We will also continue to monitor and evaluate inadequate loan pricing models in banks and microfinance to make sure that pricing models are based on scientific evidence, but also that we do not have prohibitive loan prices or even fees. We will also monitor premium receivables trends in the insurance sector, operation and cyber risk across the financial sector. We continue to analyze the risk to financial stability stemming from virtual assets which are gaining ground globally. And we will also, as a committee, pay attention to financial services consumer complaints, which left unaddressed would also pose a risk to financial stability. So the National Bank of Rwanda is committed to continuing to strengthen resilience across all financial institutions while supporting the efficient delivery of financial services. So I thank you all for your kind attention, and we welcome your questions. Over to you, Doreen.
Thank you, Governor. We are going to open up for the questions, and we'll have 3 questions for each media house for the first round, and if time allows, we'll have other questions from the same media house. Thank you. You'll have to introduce yourself and tell us which media house. Thank you.
Murakoze nyakubahwa Governor wa Central Bank, nitwa Peter Nizeyimana, ndi editor wa Tarifa Rwanda. Nkuko twemereye ibibazo bitatu ku muntu. Icyambere mperaho, muri rusange muravuga yuko ubu ifaranga rihagaze neza n'ubukungu muri rusange nubwo bwahuye n'ibibazo ariko buhagaze neza, ariko nayo mbabaze ku bibazo biri ku isi birimo n'intambara n'ubu hari imitutumba hagati ya Amerika na Iran. Hari n'umuhora wa Iran yafunze ucamo 20% bya peteroli cyangwa se bikomokaho bigera ku isi. twiteguye dute guhangana n'ubuke bwa peteroli ishobora kuzagera mu Rwanda mu gihe kiri imbere, cyane cyane nk'igihugu kidakora ku nyanja. Icyo ni kimwe. Ikindi cya kabiri ni ikijyanye no guhuza ikoranabuhanga rya za sako. Bihagaze bitese zose zamaze kwinjira muri uwo mujyo, cyangwa se hari zitarabyinjiramo, hari gukorwa iki kugira ngo bikemuke. Ikindi cya gatatu ku kijyanye na zahabu ni uburyo bwo kuba umuntu yabika amadevize cyangwa se andi mafaranga mu bundi buryo. Byo bihagaze bite? Kuko niba nibuka neza mu myaka yatambutse, niba atari uwo mwasimbuye, nimwe mwabivuzeho ku bijyanye na zahabu yabiri muri Central Bank kugira ngo ibe ubundi buryo bwo kubika amafaranga yafasha mu kubona amadevize. Murakoze cyane Governor.
I think Governor, we can take 3 then. Yes, New Times.
Yes. Thank you so much. My name is William. Work with RBA. If you may, I'll begin by requesting that you do the presentation in Kinyarwanda for other people. But I want to pick from the digital payment systems, and I want to ask about consumer protection. I think if it's not 2 weeks or a month, we saw one of the operators being sanctioned, or even I think stopped operations. But there are also cases where, for example, when making those digital transactions, in the event that you mistakenly send money to another person and then you probably follow up and find they've withdrawn, the best response you get from most of the operators is we can't help. So beyond, the only time they can help is when the money is still on the account. So if you can speak to the consumer protection, but also the projections about the inflation. Sometime in January we noticed that it was, I think, 8.9, and in your projections you've said it's going to be slightly above the target. One would wonder how exactly is the MPC safeguarding its policy credibility, but also its communication strategy. Then for someone that is probably looking at this, that is going to be continuing for the next half of 2016, what exactly, I mean in clear terms, should this mean to households, but also for small and medium businesses? Let me ask just another question, the very last one. Beyond tightening, are there probably structural measures across government that you probably as a central bank could recommend to help maybe before the projected time or before the assumed time, to help bring back the inflation in the range or in the normal target? Thank you.
Over to you, Governor.
So turahera ku kibazo cya tarifa, uko twiteguye guhangana n'ingaruka z'ibibazo tubona ku isi by'ubushyamirane. Ikigaragara nuko muri imyaka 5 ishize ibibazo byibasira ubukungu ku isi byagiye bikurikirana bitandukanye, ariko ni nkaho ari navuga imyaka kuri iyi si tubona ko buri mwaka haba hari crisis. Uhereye mu mwaka wa 2020 hari covid, kugeza mu 2021, 2022 aho twizeraga ko ubukungu bugiye noneho kongera kuzamuka, kuko icyorezo cya covid cyasaga n'ikirangiye. Haza intambara ya Ukraine n'Uburusiya, nyuma yaho haza n'ibindi bibazo byagiye bitera ingaruka byaba ku muvuduko w'ibiciro ku rwego mpuzamahanga ndetse no mu Rwanda. Ibi rero ni ibintu tumaze kumenyera no mu mibare twagiye tugaragaza yabo ku rwego rw'isi. Mubona ko hashize imyaka buri gihe tuvuga yuko kubera ibi bibazo ku isi, haba mu rwego rw'ubucuruzi ibihugu bihanganye cyangwa se bishyiraho imisoro bibuza ibicuruzwa by'ibindi bihugu kwinjira, ni ikintu kigaragaza ko hari ubushyamirane ku isi kandi atari ibintu bizarangira vuba. aha rero twerekanye mu mibare ko ibiciro bya peteroli muri uyu mwaka w'ibihumbi 2026 byitezwe ko bizagabanukaho 16%. Impamvu nuko turebye ku bakoresha ibicuruzwa bya peteroli twabonaga ko kubera ubukungu bw'isi butazamuka cyane, twanabonye ko buzagabanukaho gatoya mu bihumbi 2027, ibikomoka kuri peteroli ababisaba cyangwa demand yabo ntabwo iba yiyongera cyane. Icya kabiri twagarutseho ni uyu muryango w'ibihugu bicukurwamo peteroli ugenda ufatana y'ingamba igenda ireba uko ibikomoka kuri peteroli bishyira ku isoko. Aho rero niho mu iteganyamibare rigaragaza uko ibyo biciro bishobora kuzamuka ku masoko mpuzamahanga, ariko mu bihumbi 2027 kuko stock ibizakoreshwa mu bihumbi 2026 ibimaze kumenyekana. Ariko twerekanye ko mu mibare iteganyamibare twagaragaje hagiye habaho gushyamirana kurenza uko ari kwitezwe cyangwa uko kwari kumeze. Turongera tugahura tugasubiramo iyo mibare yaba ku uko ibikomoka kuri peteroli cyangwa se n'ibindi bicuruzwa byashobora kuba bitagera mu Rwanda kubera izo ntambara ziri ku isi. Tugenda tureba iteganyamibare icyo ritwereka n'icyo ibyo bibazo byatera ku muvuduko w'ibiciro ku isoko ryacu y'u Rwanda. Aha rero mu mibare dufite icyo tubona nuko umuvuduko w'ibiciro uzaba uri hejuru gato ya zambago hagati ya 2.8% cyane cyane mu gice cya mbere cy'umwaka w'ibihumbi 2026, ariko ukagenda umuvuduko w'ibiciro ukakomeza kumanuka cyane mu gice cya kabiri cy'umwaka, so guhera mu kwa 7 ugera mu kwa 12 tukongera gusubira ku muvuduko w'ibiciro hagati ya 2.8%. Aho rero navuga ko uko ni nayo mpamvu aka kanama ka politike y'ifaranga gaterana buri mezi 3 no kugira ngo tugende tureba uko byaba ibiterwa n'ibi bibazo kw'ibicuruzwa bigera mu Rwanda cyangwa se uko ibiciro ku masoko mpuzamahanga byiyongera cyangwa bigabanuka, ingaruka bigira ku bukungu bw'u Rwanda no ku muvuduko w'ibiciro by'ibicuruzwa biboneka mu Rwanda cyangwa se dukoresha nk'abanyarwanda. Noneho tugafata ingamba kugira ngo ibyo biciro bitarenga zambago, kandi n'izo ngamba dufata ntabwo ari izi ngamba gusa z'akanama ka politike y'ifaranga, ahubwo hari n'izindi ingamba leta nayo ikomeza gufata kugira ngo umuvuduko w'ibiciro utaba hejuru cyane. Ibyo twanabibonye mu myaka y'ibihumbi 2022, ibihumbi 2023 aho umuvuduko w'ibiciro wari wararenze 16% cyane cyane mu bihumbi 2022, leta ikashyiramo nkunganire kugira ngo ibyo bikomoka kuri peteroli ibiciro bitajya hejuru cyane. Ariko natwe nka Banki Nkuru y'u Rwanda twafataga ingamba kugira ngo ibyo biciro umuvuduko w'ibiciro ugabanuke, kandi byarashobotse nk'uko umuntu ashubijeho iriya slide yerekana uko umuvuduko w'ibiciro wagiye wiyongera mu myaka yashize ukagabanuka. Murabona ko ingamba zose zagiye zifatwa uhereye mu bihumbi 2022 aho umuvuduko w'ibiciro wari hejuru cyane, bikongera bikagabanuka ndetse kugeza umwaka ushize aho twari tukiri hagati ya zambago za 2.8%. Aho rero duhora twiteguye kandi dukomeza gukora isesengura kugira ngo turebe ko hataba ingaruka z'umurengera ku muvuduko w'ibiciro mu Rwanda. Ku kibazo cyerekeranye nuko sako zirimo guhuzwa ku rwego rw'uturere, aho ndaza gusaba umuyobozi w'agateganyo w'ishami rishinzwe tutajegajega ku rwego rw'imari Bernard kuza gusubiza. Mbanze nsubiza iki kibazo cyo kuri zahabu. Aha twari twarabitangaje ko nka Banki Nkuru y'u Rwanda zahabu ari kimwe mu byo dushobora gushoramo imari nk'igihugu kugira ngo dukumire ingaruka z'ibibazo na geopolitical dynamics tubona, cyane cyane nuko ubukungu ku isi bugenda buhindagurika. Twari kandi twanatangaje ko guhera mu kwezi kwa 7 twatangiye gushora imari muri zahabu, kandi ni igikorwa gikomeza kuko tubona ko ari asset cyangwa ishoramari muri zahabu ritanga umusaruro, kandi nkuko abakunda kubibona mu matangazamakuru mpuzamahanga byaba banki nkuru zo mu karere byaba banki nkuru zo ku isi zose zongereye ishoramari zikora muri zahabu, na banki nkuru y'u Rwanda rero irimo, kandi ni ibintu bizakomeza kuko tubona ko no ku isoko mpuzamahanga igiciro cya zahabu gikomeje kwiyongera cyane, bikaba rero ari umusaruro natwe tubona nka banki nkuru y'u Rwanda kandi ufasha mu gusigasira kutajegajega k'ubukungu bwacu nk'u Rwanda. Bernard.
Murakoze. Ku bijyanye n'ikoranabuhanga riri gukorwa muri sako, mwabonye ko ari n'umwanzuro wafashwe mu mushyikirano. Ubu guhuza za sako, umurenge sako ku rwego rw'akarere byararangiye. Ubu dufite imirenge sako z'akarere 30. Noneho igikurikiyeho nuko abanyamuryango bafashwa koroherezwa mu kubona serivisi. Ubu abanyamuryango bamaze kwemererwa cyane cyane muri buri sako kwemererwa gukoresha telefoni babitsa cyangwa babikuza kuri telefoni. Ni igikorwa twanakwishimira ko uyu munsi ntabwo ari ngombwa ko umunyamuryango yajya kuri sako kubitsa cyangwa kubikuza. Ubu yabitsa akoresha telefone cyangwa akabikuza. Ni igikorwa rero kirimo kugenda gikorwa. Ubu dufite district sako zimaze kujya muri iryo koranabuhanga ryo kubitsa no kubikuza kuri telefone, zimaze kuba 14 mu gihugu cyose. Ni igikorwa kizakomeza nk'uko byemejwe mu mushyikirano ko kigomba kurangira bitarenze mu kwa gatandatu uyu mwaka. Urumva ari icyo navuga murakoze.
And then on the questions from William, first I will do the summary in Kinyarwanda, probably at the end of the session, to recap the main message for our Kinyarwanda viewers. But on your questions, first on what the central bank is doing in terms of containing frauds in digital payments, and also the refund mechanism by especially mobile money operators. And then I will come back also to the payment service provider that we decided to suspend for 3 months for non-compliance with our regulatory requirements. What we've observed as central bank is that frauds linked to the use of digital payments have decreased in 2025, thanks to different coordinated action by the National Central Bank, but also security organs and the payment service providers themselves, where we can see that fraud cases continue to reduce, and we have what we call a fraud prevention forum, which has National Bank of Rwanda and other stakeholders to continue monitoring the root causes of frauds and also take appropriate actions to prevent them. So probably I will ask Moise to give numbers on the fraud cases in 2025 compared to 2024 after this question. Second, we have reinforced our supervision on IT systems of all payment system providers. We have trained and conducted awareness not only on cybersecurity risk, but also operational risk that we see due to the increased digitization of our financial service, including trainings and awareness to the board of directors of financial institutions that are in charge of oversight of those institutions. Third is to continue working with the National Cybersecurity Agency to train enough skilled IT supervisor cybersecurity professionals in the country, because we know that digitization and introduction of digital channels and technology-driven innovation in our financial sector is something that we are looking towards because of increased productivity, but then we have to have enough safeguards and guardrails for prevention of frauds or cyber attacks, and that is something that we take seriously as a central bank. Refund mechanism in mobile money services. So each PSP has its own policy for refund, but we also have regulation in that regard. The reason why the refund cannot be automatic is that if we were to allow everyone who, let's say, pays for goods on a merchant code and then sends a message saying this was an error, what you would see is people buying goods and then saying that it was an error, they have the goods, they have left the shop, and then they tell the PSP to refund that money. And that's why there's that check for the recipient to also agree that this was an erroneous transfer. Otherwise, there would be abuses where I pay for goods or services and then I say it was an error when I have consumed those services. So there has to be mechanisms to make sure that payments that are due are made through digital channels and people do not abuse them saying they were undue. What we have also seen and we continue to monitor is that in some cases the recipient refuses to give the money, and this is normally because of bad faith. And unfortunately, if we are to allow that everyone gets the refunds, as I explained, the risks of payments that are being refunded for no good reason outweighs the risk of the few cases where the recipient does not accept, and that has to be then escalated to investigation and sometimes, might be a court case. But we continue to make sure that we can refine that refund mechanism so that people who in good faith have made a mistake, the time it takes for that refund mechanism is reduced, and we see less and less complaints for people who in good faith made an erroneous transaction. Moise, you can also compliment on the fraud numbers in 2025 compared to 2024.
Thank you, Governor. We have observed that the fraud numbers kept reducing, and as in 2024 December, we had 5,000 cases, but these have reduced up to 3,000 cases of fraud, and the concentration of these frauds is mainly on mobile payment, and of course they are not of bigger values, but we have observed month on month, quarter on quarter, the reduction of number of cases, and the main reason of reduction of these cases is the campaigns that have been taking place. You are aware that in the previous months we have been conducting the Mamatwi campaign. This is a campaign that the central bank has been conducting along with partners such as Rura, mobile money providers, RIB. All these put together the efforts to make sure that financial service consumers are aware of fraud cases and the ways that people keep using to manipulate and make sure that they abuse. And as of now, we are conducting cashless awareness campaign. This, of course, is also in line with making sure that consumers are aware of what they are ought to do whenever these fraudulent people approach them. Of recent now, they are calling themselves reg staff. I think that you've been called, or they send messages, texting, send money here. But through awareness, people get to know, and they are no longer following the instructions that are given by fraudsters. So we will continue making sure that we educate people and take all the measures that will help us to reduce these frauds up to a low level. They are reducing, but they are still high, and that's why all these efforts are being implemented to reduce them. Thank you.
Now the two other questions which are related to the Monetary Policy Committee decision, communication, and also the basis of it and impact. First and foremost, as Monetary Policy Committee, our mandate is to make sure that we can use the tools that the central bank has to ensure low and stable inflation. That's why we have a target band of 2 to 8%, which for our economy is deemed appropriate to allow sustainable economic growth. So whenever we see that inflation is going to go beyond that target band, we need to take action. And this is based on the data analysis that we do, but also taking a forward-looking stance. That's where the projections come in. And projections, if we take projections we had in November, we had already expressed concerns that we would have to revise those projections if two risks materialized. One, lower than expected agricultural production. Second, any increase in energy inflation that would drive up headline inflation. At that time, we had headline inflation around 7%. Unfortunately, those two risks materialized in the last 3 months of 2025 and even in January, where because of the lower than expected season A agricultural production, the energy prices, not only in pump prices that were revised upward in November, but we've seen also charcoal on the market because of the slower supply increase. And those two factors amplified already pressures we had seen on core inflation. Core inflation meaning the prices that I mentioned on hotels, restaurants, on housing. And these had already started increasing because of administered prices like medical tariffs that were increased in the second half of 2026. And those tariffs, when they increase, they have a second round effect on other services, which you only observed after a number of months. So those combined factors have contributed to the revision of the projections. And as monetary policy, we decided to increase the central bank rate to make sure that we can bring back inflation to the band that we always look at, 2 to 8%, before we let inflation run amok, if I could say, because then you would already be hampering economic growth that we see is still strong, and that's how you maintain that economic growth. Now, as central bank, we also acknowledge that monetary policy transmission mechanism is limited. You don't see the effect on demand that you would expect immediately. And for the volatile components of inflation, food, energy, central bank tools are not enough. So you need to complement those measures with some fiscal measures, the same way we had seen in 2022 and 2023, where government was subsidizing transport prices, subsidizing fuel prices to make sure that inflation doesn't go beyond the 8% bound. So we continue to work with different stakeholders in government to show them where we're seeing pressures in inflation and where policy measures need to be taken in terms of increasing agricultural production for season B starting now, and then season C, because we want to have sustainable and I would say performing agriculture period to offset the pressure we see in core inflation. Second, we also know that core inflation pressures will start easing from July because the effect on the administered prices that were increased in the second half of the year start fading out in that period. Third is the continuous monitoring of any developments and making sure that we provide data-driven economic advice to government whenever we see developments on international markets that may impact the different components of CPI. So that's how, although the Monetary Policy Committee meets every quarter, the central bank continues to monitor on a daily basis recent developments, and the Monetary Policy Committee, if needed, might meet even before those 3 months to take necessary action so that we adjust policy to make sure that in the near term, inflation goes back down. And we're seeing that with this CBR increase and also the government measures that they have taken, we have seen that in the resolutions of the National Dialogue this month, resolutions that are targeting increasing productivity in agriculture, in manufacturing, those are really measures that will support the moderation of inflation that we're seeing. So I will pause here and then we can take another round of questions, but we ask one question per person so that everyone gets a chance to speak.
Thank you, Governor. So let's take a question from Katie Press, then Mama Urwagasa.
Thank you. My name is Sam Nkurunziza. I write for Katie Press. I have two questions, but the other one is too short. So the first one is, from the explanations you've given on even the risk factors that you expect as we go on in this financial year, it seems that some performances are even exceeding expectations in some sectors. Thank you. Sam Nkurunziza from Katie Press. Yeah, from the explanations that you have given, the performance somehow, even in some sectors, exceeds the expectations. Should we say that the bank is now shifting, or are they looking at a possibility of shifting from stabilization to growth support? Should markets anticipate anything like a recalibration of interest rates or liquidity policies in the near future? Finally, while the headline indicators look positive, how confident are you that inflation pressures are structurally contained rather than temporarily suppressed by global trends? Thank you.
Kindly, let's stick to one question per media house because time is not on our side. Thank you.
Murakoze, nitwa Ishimwe Honore, naturutse kuri Mama RwandaTV. Mwagaragaje muri kwa kubungabunga ifaranga kugira ritashegashega, hari n'uburyo bwo kwishyura mu ikoranabuhanga, ariko usanga hari abacuruzi bamwe binangira ko hakoreshwa buriya buryo bwa cashless kwishyura ku makode, ugasanga abo barifuza ko bishyurwa kuri telefone isanzwe. Mubona bitakoma mu nkokora intego ziba zihari zo kugera ku bipimo mwatweretse? Murakoze.
We can also take other two, then so Radio 10 and then Royal FM.
Murakoze. Fana nitwa Imezi, ndi umunyamakuru kuri Radio DC na TV 10. Kimwe mu bintu bituma habaho inflation, umusaruro mukeya ukomoka ku buhinzi. Mu kwezi kwa mbere Beneri yagiye n'inzego zitandukanye by'umwihariko harimo n'ubuhinzi. Nifuzaga kubaza muri ibyo biganiro mwagiranye n'izo nzego, cyane cyane kongera umusaruro w'ubuhinzi, nizihe ngamba zirambye z'igihe kirekire zaba zarafashwe kugira ngo umusaruro w'ubuhinzi urusheho kwiyongera? Murakoze.
Murakoze cyane. Nitwa Moses Kwishimwe, naturutse kuri Royal FM. Hanyuma niba narebye neza ibitumizwa mu mahanga byazamutseho 16 n'ibice 8 kwijana. Hanyuma ibyoherezwa mu mahanga bizamukaho 14 n'igice kimwe kwijana. Hanyuma imwe mu myanzuro y'inama y'umushyirano yateranye kwa tariki 5 kwa tariki 6, ubwo ndavuga kurebana n'inganda, n'umwanzuro wa 4 havuzwe harimo gufasha by'umwihariko inganda hagamijwe kongera umusaruro n'ubushobozi bwo guhatana ku isoko no kongera agaciro k'ibyo zikora no gukemura ikibazo cy'ibyo gupfunyikamo ibicuruzwa bikorwa. Hanyuma ntekereza ko ari umwanzuro wazigihe kugira ngo mite nkibabaza rwose hari icyo abanyenganda bagomba kwitega kuri Beneri muri kubafasha by'umwihariko gufasha izi nganda n'iki ngiki cyo gupfunyikamo ngira ngo muraza kugikomozaho. Murakoze.
Thank you. Ibibazo bimwe bagenzi banjye dukorana muri Beneri baramfasha. The first question from Katie Press, the chief economist can comment on it, as well as the, I would say, 1.5 question on the global developments versus inflation trends and how we bring it down. Ikibazo cya Mama Urwagasabo kuri cashless agenda abacuruzi bamwe batemera ko bishyurwa hakoreshejwe ikoranabuhanga. Ubwo Moyize ushinzwe ishami ryo guteza imbere urwego rw'imari araza kugisubiza. Iki cya Radio 10 kubyerekeranye n'ingamba zo kugira ngo ubuhinzi bwacu bushobore gutera imbere, icyo navuga nuko dukorana cyane cyane n'inzego zose zishinzwe ubuhinzi, turi ndetse no mu kanama kareba uko umusaruro w'ubuhinzi muri buri season y'ubuhinzi bugenda, dufatanyije na Minisiteri y'Ubuhinzi n'Ubworozi ndetse n'ikigo cy'ibarushamibare. Imyanzuro yo mu mushyikirano ni imyanzuro igaragaza ibigomba gukorwa kugira ngo umusaruro wiyongere. Kubera ihindagurika ry'ibihe n'ihindagurika ry'ikirere, ni ngombwa ko kugira ngo tugire umusaruro w'ubuhinzi urambye kandi udakomwa mu nkokora n'ibihindagurika ry'ikirere cyangwa ry'ibihe, nuko hakomeza gushyirwa imbaraga mu kuhira n'izi irrigation projects ziri mu gukorwa zikihutishwa. Icya kabiri ni ugukomeza kureba kuri quality cyangwa se ko abahinzi bakomeza kubona imbuto nziza ndetse n'inyongeramusaruro. Hakaba no gukomeza guhuza amakuru kugira ngo ahabonetse ikibazo cyatuma umusaruro w'ubuhinzi ukorwa mu nkokora, haba ingamba zihuse zo kugira ngo dushobore kubona uwo musaruro. Ikindi nka Banki Nkuru y'u Rwanda twagarutseho mu kwereka tuganira ku myanzuro yavuye mu kanama gashinzwe ukutajegajega ku rwego rw'imari, nuko tubona ko hari ingamba zigomba gufatwa kugira ngo amafaranga cyangwa se inguzanyo zihabwa uru rwego rw'ubuhinzi ziyongera. Twabonye ko urwego rw'ubuhinzi cyane cyane amabanki adatanga inguzanyo ku kigero gishimishije, nubwo nayo agenda agaragaza imbogamizi, cyane cyane imishinga imwe minini amabanki yagiye aha inguzanyo mu buhinzi ntigende neza, bigatuma atinya gukomeza gutanga inguzanyo muri urwo rwego. Ariko hanashyizweho gahunda cyane cyane iyi gahunda y'ubwishingizi mu rwego rw'ubuhinzi, ituma ibyago byo kugira ngo umuntu wabonye inguzanyo adashobora kwishyura neza bigabanuke. Ariko haracyari imbogamizi nyinshi, niyo mpamvu akanama gashinzwe kureba ubutajegajega bw'urwego rw'imari rwasabye ko nka Banki Nkuru y'u Rwanda dukora inyigo yimbitse kugira ngo turebe ibikoma mu nkokora izo nguzanyo zijya mu rwego rw'ubuhinzi zishobore kwiyongera, ndetse tunareba n'ibindi byafasha kugabanya risk tubona muri urwo rwego. Igishimishije ni uko tubona ko ku rwego rw'ibigo by'imari biciriritse microfinance, inguzanyo ku rwego rw'ubuhinzi zariyongereye, ubu zigeze kuri miliyari zigera ku 108 z'amafaranga y'u Rwanda ni mu mwaka ushize, aho ziyongereyeho kuri 12% niba ntibeshye. Aho rero tubona yuko hari urwego mu nzego z'imari rukomeje kwegera abahinzi kandi rubaha inguzanyo ku rwego rushimishije. Iyo nyigo yerekeranye no kongera inguzanyo ku rwego rw'ubuhinzi nimara gusozwa tukanayiganiraho n'inzego zitandukanye, tuzabagezaho ibyavuyemo n'ingamba zigiye gukorwa kugira ngo twongere inguzanyo mu buhinzi, kuko nabyo bifasha mu kongera umusaruro. Ikibazo cya Royal FM cyerekeranye n'ibigiye gukorwa kugira ngo umusaruro mu nganda wiyongere ndetse bifasha no kongera ibyo twohereza mu mahanga, ubwo ndaza gusaba Deputy Governor nawe abikomozeho, ariko twaha ijambo Chief Economist on the questions from KT Press.
Thank you, Governor. Now, on the question on GDP growth being higher than expected, is true. If you look at 2025, the first 3 quarters, we had 6.5, 7.8, and 11.8%, especially in the third quarter. So the third quarter growth was high. The main drivers, half of our economy is coming from services, but all sectors performed well. So your question was about shifting, if the bank is shifting from stabilization to growth support. What I would like to say here is that basically throughout, looking at our mandate, which is price stability, by definition, this is to support growth in the medium to long term. Because when inflation is stable, that's the precondition for growth to remain high at this level for a long period of time. And if you see our Vision 2050 and our NST2, this is what we want. So basically, price stability is the main condition, one of the preconditions for this growth to sustain. So when prices are this inflation is between 2 and 8%, this is our target. Right now, it's slightly above, and this is why the MPC decided to increase interest rates. So what we do is to focus on price stability so that we can achieve sustainable growth. There's no real shift here between stabilization or growth support. All in the end is to support growth in the long term. Your second question is about, I think you said global and the link with inflation. I'm not sure if I got the second question well. Is that the one?
I said the indicators look good. So I said the indicators look positive. So I was wondering, are you confident that the inflation pressures are structurally contained rather than temporarily suspended?
Okay. So what we are seeing now is more of temporary pressures, mainly coming from seasonal factors. So the weather factors affecting so that's climate change in general, affecting the agricultural production for season A. Season A is harvest is supposed to be from December up to now. We're supposed to have the season A, and the next harvest is expected in May, June. This is season B. So what we are seeing is that because this harvest was lower than expected, this is why we are seeing price pressures on price of food and increase in inflation. But this is temporary. If we have a better season next time in season B and season C and going forward, then these prices will stabilize. And the other factors that are driving are some also temporary. And as the governor explained, even the changes that happened in the last second half of 2025, electricity, etc., they will fade away in the second half of the year. So most of the pressure that we are seeing are temporary. And we are taking action now so that actually inflation normalizes in the second half of the year, and at the end of the year we go back to our bond. Thank you.
Governor, we have 15 minutes left.
Yes, there were questions not answered. One on cashless, and abacuruzi batemera ko bishyurwa ubwo Moise yagisubiza. Hanyuma hari n'icyo Deputy Governor ku ngamba zo kongera umusaruro w'inganda ari gusubiza.
Murakoze Governor yagize ati kwishyura, hari abacuruzi basaba ko bishyurwa hakoreshejwe telefone. Navuga ngo aho kugira ngo bakoreshe ziriya merchant code baba bafite, mwagize mutese ntabwo byaba bikoma mu nkokora ibyo kwishyura nakoresheje ikoranabuhanga. Igisubizo ni yego, bikoma mu nkokora. Impamvu nuko iyo umucuruzi asabye ugura ko amwishyura akoresheje telefone, hari ikiguzi ugura yongera kugira ngo iyo yohereje umuntu amafaranga hari ikiguzi wishyura. Birumvikana rero ko iyo ugura asabwe kwishyura akoresheje telefone, hari icyo kiguzi kiyongera gishobora gukoma mu nkokora kuba we yari kwishyura akoresheje ikoranabuhanga, ahubwo agahitamo wenda kubikura amafaranga icyarimwe hanyuma akishyura cash. Igisubizo ni yego, byabikoma mu nkokora. Ariko nanone bikeneye gusobanuka neza ko ntabwo ubundi mucuruzi yakabaye asaba ugura ko amwishyura akoresheje telefone kandi afite iriya kode yishyurwa ho. Abacuruzi rero wenda abatarasobanukirwa, hari abagisaba abantu ko bakoresha telefone kubera ko hari ikiguzi nabo bishyura iyo bakiriye amafaranga. Ariko byumvikane neza ko umuguzi ntaki acibwa, ntacyo agomba kwishyurwa, kuko hari aho byagaragaye ko hari n'abacuruzi basaba abantu kurenzaho, ariko ibyo ngibyo ntabwo ari byo. Kuko mu nkokora rero turabibona ko bihari, ariko ni nayo mpamvu dufite ingamba z'icyo dukora. Nigeze mbere kuvuga ku kibazo cyari cyabajijwe mbere ku bukangurambaga bukorwa, n'uyu munsi tuburimo. Ngira ngo turazenguruka igihugu cyose kandi tujya mu byiciro bitandukanye kugira ngo abantu bumve ibyiza biri mu kuba umuntu yakwishyura hakoreshejwe ikoranabuhanga. N'abacuruza bamaze kubisobanukirwa barabona ko bibafitiye inyungu cyane, kabone n'ubwo hari igiciro cyaba gihari. Icyo ngicyo ni kimwe. Icya kabiri cy'ingenzi cyane ni mu minsi yashize ntabwo byari byoroshye ko umuntu yakwishyurwa bivuye mu kigo cy'imari kimwe runaka ngo yishyure akoresheje ikindi kigo cy'imari. Ariko nk'uko mubizi, uyu munsi hari e-cash. Muri e-cash umuntu wishyura mu buryo bwa telefone, mutanga serivisi z'imari akoresheje telefone mu kigo kimwe runaka, yohereza mu kindi kigo nta kiguzi kiyongereyeho. ubu ngubu hari n'amabwiriza ya Banki Nkuru y'u Rwanda yashyizwe hanze ataratangira kubahirizwa, azatangira kubahirizwa mu mezi ari imbere mu kwezi kwa kane, asaba ko izi transaction ubwishyu bwose buto buca muri ibikorwa remezo bya e-cash. Ahangaha rero twiteze ko ikiguzi cyo guhererekanya amafaranga kizagabanuka. Ushaka gukura amafaranga kuri telefone yawe ukayohereza mugenzi wawe, cyangwa se ukohereza mu kigo cy'imari kindi gitandukanye, yaba banki yaba ikigo cy'imari iciriritse. Ibi bikorwa remezo byose impamvu bijyaho ni ukugira ngo uburyo bwo kwishyurana hakoresheje ikoranabuhanga bworohe, ndetse cyifuzwa nuko igiciro cyagabanuka ikajya ku buryo hasi hashoboka. Nubwo wenda tuvuze ko cyaba zero kuko ibikorwa remezo birishyurwa, ariko icyifuzwa nuko igiciro cyakomeza kugabanuka, kandi nyirango mwarabibonye ko kigenda kigabanuka. Ubwo rero icyo twiteze cyane nuko muri e-cash ho kizakomeza kugabanuka cyane, ndetse bikorohera abantu kuba bakwishyura mu buryo butandukanye, kugira ngo bya bibazo byose byariho by'abacuruzi yuko banga uburyo bumwe, nibura hari uburyo bwinshi bushobora gukoreshwa kugira ngo bashe kwakira ubwishyu.
Deputy Governor.
Thank you, Governor. Mindful about time, manufacturing capacity and output is constrained by, I would say, 5 things. 1, technology. 2, raw materials. 3, capacity. And then market and financing. Those 5 things are different initiatives are being taken. From the perspective of capacity, there are efforts around TVETs being to ensure that there is staff who have expertise to be able to support manufacturing output. From the perspective of raw materials, you have to see if whatever one is manufacturing is locally sourced or whether it's imported. Again, there are different initiatives that are being undertaken by government to support from that perspective. I want to speak more ko ikibazo abaje ngo expectations bagira kuri beneri nizihe. We are now looking at the other constraint around access to funding, both in terms of affordability and also from the perspective of tenure. Kono hano wakunze kuba ikibazo. Ariko nko mwabibonye muri presentation governor yakoze, manufacturing sector iri muri sectors ubungubu funding iri mu increasing. No kuvuga ngo there is enhanced appetite from providers of funding to manufacturing sector. Ni naho hantu beneri iri mu komeza gushyira ingamba kureba yuko banks no kuvuga debt ariko n'abandi ba funding a manufacturing sector ukuvuga ngo providers of equity iri mu increasing in terms of volume, no kureba yuko iyo funding ko mubizi manufacturing sector ni sector ifata igihe kugira ngo igire return. So no kureba yuko niba ari debt ari igihe kinini, ariko no kureba yuko rate igabanuka. Nanone uko presentation yabigaragaje, rate to lending rates ziri mu kugabanuka. So nicyo kintu navuga beneri iri mu gukora ku engaging government ariko na private sector, no banks and other providers of capital, kureba yuko volume na tenure ya funding to the manufacturing sector increasing. Murakoze.
Twafata ibibazo bibiri bya nyuma hanyuma tugakora summary mu Kinyarwanda.
Okay. So we'll do the New Times and then Reuters and I don't know which media house and then the lady behind. So.
Kimwe kigufi and then we can conclude.
Yeah, mine is very quick. My name is Julius. I work for the New Times. So with the committee, the MPC deciding to increase the policy rate by 50 basis points, I'm very curious to understand what factors specifically convinced the committee that the current policy stance is not or is no longer sufficiently tight to the extent that you decided to increase. And lastly, to that, how did the committee vote? When do you start announcing those decisions or deliberations?
Thank you. My name is Philbert. I work for Reuters. Mine is very simple. Governor, could you clarify to us, it's just a clarity on the gold purchase. Could you provide maybe the total volume acquired so far? Thank you.
Merci. Je suis Anastase Rwanda. Je travaille pour la Une. Ma question porte sur l'énergie, en particulier l'électricité, qui constitue l'un des piliers essentiels de la croissance économique, notamment dans le secteur industriel. Dans ce domaine, les coupures répétées d'électricité observées ces dernières semaines préoccupent de nombreux opérateurs économiques et peuvent constituer un frein à l'afflux des investisseurs dans le pays. Est-ce que la BNR ne considère pas que cette situation pourrait affecter la dynamique de croissance économique et accentuer l'inflation? Quelles recommandations pouvez-vous adresser au gouvernement pour faire face à ce défi potentiel? Merci.
Murakoze, nitwa Ndayishimiye Thierry, ndi umunyamakuru w'Isango Star. Nyakubahwa Gavana, turagira ngo mubwire abanyarwanda mu Kinyarwanda icyo bakwitega ku isoko, ku biciro biri hano hanze ku isoko, abiteze ku biciro bigabanuka. Niki nihe message baha bakwitega kuri kino gihembwe? Ikindi kibazo kigufi, hari ikijya n'igiceri cya 20 hano hanze, ikibazo mu baturage cyane cyane mu bice by'intara, aho usanga umuturage niba agiye kugura igicuruzwa kigura 1570, bahita bamubwira ko arenzaho 50. 20 ntago bayafata, niyo yarenzaho nabo ntago bamusubiza. Baribaza abaturage, se igiceri cya 20 ntago kigikora, ntago kisohoka? Turagira ngo mubasubize. Murakoze cyane.
Murakoze kuri ibyo bibazo. Ndatangira ku kibazo cya New Times n'icya Reuters, ibijyanye n'ibibazo bya Isango Star, ku byo abaturage bakwitega ku biciro ku masoko muri mezi ari imbere. Unaza gusaba Joy uri mu gashami gashinzwe politike y'ifaranga kuza gusubiza, hanyuma na Chantal ku ibiceri bya 20 byo biracyahari, n'ingamba tuba dufite kugira ngo ibyo bibazo byaho byaba byarabuze bikemuke. Et je répondrai aussi à la question posée par la Une. On questions from New Times, the increase of the central bank rate, as we explained, there are several factors that the monetary policy looks at to be able to take an informed decision. First, what is data telling us on the path of inflation in the coming months, policy horizon of 12 months, but also taking into account the actual inflation numbers that we have. So we have observed that in the fourth quarter of 2025, we were approaching the upper bound of 8%, because in the fourth quarter the inflation was at 7.4%, but it had been increasing from quarter to quarter throughout 2025. We had also observed that core inflation remains above 8%, and so the risk that we had seen that the component of the CPI which are more volatile, food, as I explained, and energy, if they had continued pressures, then that was a risk to our outlook that we had in November. And so regrettably, those two risks materialized, lower than expected food production, which led to lower, I would say, a food inflation decline, which would have offset the core inflation pressures. Second, energy inflation, which was on the back of electricity tariffs being revised upward in October, pump prices revised in November, and then charcoal, which is still used by many Rwandans for their cooking, which also has increased, especially in December and January. And so headline inflation, which is the one we track, which needs to remain between 2 and 8%, reached 8% in December, 8.9% in January. And we always look at projections. We can see that the path until for the full first half of 2026, the potential for that headline inflation to be slightly above 8% is very high. And with those factors, we decided to increase the central bank rate so that we can start seeing a reduction of headline inflation in the second half of 2026 and not wait until we actually continue to see for another number of months an increase in that inflation. Second, it's a signal we are giving to the market, to investors, to households, that the central bank is taking these headline inflation developments seriously, and that is taking action to make sure that inflation comes back 2 to 8%. The reason why we always want to make sure that we don't go above 8% in inflation is that the impact of high inflation or a persistent high inflation on our economic growth is high. There's no country that can have sustainable economic growth if their inflation is not contained. And the ambition of our country and the GDP growth targets for NST2 are extremely high, around 9% every year. We haven't reached it, and if we don't contain inflation, the likelihood of not achieving it is high. So that's why, looking at those factors, we decided to increase this central bank rate, but also continue working with other stakeholders to make sure that other measures that needs to be taken to increase production, being in agriculture, but also we don't lose sight of what needs to be done in terms of our external sector to be performing and reduce trade deficit. These are measures that we continue to monitor and also give advice on as we conduct research on the main factors that could increase productivity overall in our country. Lastly, as a central bank, we're also mindful of the purchasing power of Rwandan citizens, and we cannot allow ourselves not to take necessary actions when we're seeing that these inflationary pressures are having a direct impact on households in terms of purchasing powers, because they are very affected by food inflation and energy inflation. So that's the main rationale for our central bank rate increase, and we continue monitoring developments as we expressed. A question from Reuters, gold. We do not publish our gold investments because these are part of all publication that we publish at the end of the financial year through our annual reports. But as for many central banks, gold investments are one investment that we see respond to 3 criteria that are important for every central bank when investing foreign reserves: capital preservation, steady returns, but also liquidity. And gold has all those 3 factors for the time being. We know also it's a volatile asset, but for the time being, the returns are still steady. And secondly, central banks always diversify their asset pool. You don't invest in 1 or 2 assets. And because of that diversification strategy, we are in the, I would say, the target investment limits for gold, where central banks invest between 10 and 15% of their foreign exchange reserves in gold. So we are in that range as well. But you will have to be patient and wait for our annual report for this year to get the real numbers. Thank you.
How did the committee vote?
So our committee, for now we don't disclose vote, but we usually work on consensus. and we haven't seen any dissent on this particular decision to increase the CBR by 50 basis points.
Do you plan to change that, to start announcing that?
We are not an advanced economy, but if we are committed enough and get to high income levels, definitely then that would also mean that as central bank we already considered as advanced central bank and start emulating what advanced economies are doing. Thank you. Isango Star, ibibazo babajije ku biciro, Joy, and then Chantal, and then ndaza kugaruka ku kibazo cya Lawine dusoza.
Murakoze. Ikibazo cyabajijwe kijyanye no kureba uko ibiciro bizaba byifashe ku muturage wibaza ko ibiciro bigiye kumera mu minsi iri imbere, ngira ngo nibyo byari byasobanuwe ko urebye n'icyemezo cyafashwe nuko hagaragara yuko mu gihembwe kiri imbere, kino gihembwe cya mbere cya 2026, biragaragara ko ibiciro bizaba bikiri hejuru, ari nayo mpamvu hafashwe icyemezo cyo kugira ngo hazamurwe inyungu fatizo ya banki nkuru y'u Rwanda kugira ngo bibe byagaruka mu mbago ngenderwaho. Ariko icyo twababwira nuko mu mpera z'umwaka 2026 haragaragara ko iteganyamibare ryerekana yuko uyu muvuduko w'ibiciro uzaba wagabanutse ukagaruka mu mbago ngenderwaho iyo iri hagati ya 2.8%. Icyo twakwibutsa abaturage nuko hano ntabwo tuba tuvuga ko ari ibiciro kumanuka, turavuga umuvuduko no kuvuga ngo uburyo bizamuka cyangwa se bimanuka, uburyo bihinduka nibwo buzagenda bugabanuka. Ntabwo ari igiciro babona kizaba cyamanutse, aho no tujya dusobanura ibiciro hamwe n'ihindagurika ry'ibiciro. Irihindagurika ry'ibiciro mu mpera z'umwaka iteganyamibare irerekana yuko bizaba byagarutse mu mbago ngenderwaho hagati ya 2.8%. Murakoze gahunda.
Murakoze gahunda ku kibazo cy'igiceri cya 20. Icyo nagira ngo nizeze umunyamakuru nuko iki gikora gihari. Mu by'ukuri dufite ibiceri by'ubwoko butandatu, dufite ikijana, 50, 20, 10, amafaranga 5 ndetse n'ifaranga rimwe. Ibyo byose birahari mu bubiko bwacu kandi biracyakoreshwa. Wakwibaza wenda impamvu abacuruzi badashaka gusubiza aya 20. Icyagaragaye nuko uko abantu bagenda bitabira gukoresha ikoranabuhanga, ntabwo umucuruzi aba yumva wenda ko azasabwa gusubiza ibyo biceri bito, bigatuma batajya mu mabanki yabo cyangwa ibigo by'imari gushaka ibyo biceri. Ni ikintu tumaze kubona. Icyo tugomba gukora rero ni iki? Nuko hari ubukangurambaga turimo gukora kuri cashless, ariko n'ukuntu twafata amafaranga neza. Ndumva ikibazo cy'ibiceri nacyo tuzakigarukaho, tugashishikariza abacuruzi banini. Mu by'ukuri ubona abacuruzi banini bitabira kubikuza ibiceri ni amafarumasi cyangwa se za supermarket, ariko abandi bacuruzi ubona rwose batabikuza ibiceri kubera ko baba bategereje nyine kwishyurwa hakoreshejwe ikoranabuhanga. Tuzakigarukaho icyo kibazo cy'ibiceri, ariko tuzanaganira n'amabanki kugira ngo agishishikariza abakiriya babo kubikuza ibiceri kugira ngo bigere ku muturage. Murakoze.
Ndumva twahinira aha iki kiganiro, twagira ngo tubashimire abanyamakuru. Sorry. La question là, il y a la question de l'énergie, c'est une question vaste, et de dire que la Banque nationale du Rwanda n'en tient pas compte ne serait pas correct. Il y a plusieurs, je dirais, défis. La production de l'électricité, la distribution, tout comme tout pays en voie de développement. Il y a eu beaucoup d'investissements du gouvernement pour une production d'électricité. Vous avez vu les derniers chiffres que 84% des ménages rwandais ont maintenant accès à l'électricité par rapport à moins de 20% il y a 20 ans. Donc cet effort doit être souligné. En revanche, il y a encore quelques défis dans la distribution et le ministère en charge des infrastructures et de l'énergie, il travaille amplement. Notre mandat, c'est la stabilité des prix, et évidemment, nous regardons aussi tous les facteurs qui pourraient impacter cette stabilité des prix. Le fait qu'il y a eu une augmentation des prix d'électricité, c'est pour pouvoir faciliter et augmenter la capacité des agences en charge de la production et de la distribution d'énergie pour que cette électricité soit stable et que en particulier le secteur de l'industrie où les usines puissent avoir non seulement de l'électricité à un prix moins élevé, mais aussi je dirais, distribution non interrompue d'électricité. Nous ne sommes pas encore au niveau de dire que nous n'avons pas d'interruption en termes d'électricité, mais nous sommes confiants que tous les efforts qui sont en train d'être faits par le gouvernement dans la production et la distribution, mais aussi dans la diversification des sources d'énergie, pourra pallier à ce problème et que nous pourrons voir une stabilité de production dans le secteur industriel également. J'espère que ça répond à votre question. Merci. So twagira ngo tubashimire ku bwitabire bwanyu kandi twizera ko mudutumikira neza n'abandi baba bagifite ibibazo ubwo agashami kacu gashinzwe itangazamakuru nako kareba uko kabasubiza kandi kakabagezaho impuguke dufite muri Banki Nkuru y'u Rwanda ku buryo basubiza ibibazo byanyu. Murakoze, mbifurije umunsi mwiza. Thank you to the audience online as well.